Michael Longley was born in Belfast and educated at Trinity College, Dublin. His life as a poet has been spent largely in Belfast, though in latter years, journeys as far afield as to Japan and to Greece have shaped and nurtured a new flowering in his poems. He is a man with a great feel and reverence for the classical values of form and decorum, qualities which he has brought powerfully into his own work. Michael, I suppose the obvious question is, where did it begin for you?
Well, I was always interested in words. I mean, I can remember even at primary school, rather enjoying exercises which the other boys and girls didn't care for, like learning passages of the Old Testament by heart and writing about the summer holidays. And then when I went to secondary school, I remember I used to set aside most of Sunday morning to write the essay, which was quite unnecessary. I was obsessed with finding the right words to express my half-baked emotions as a young teenager. And then when I was about 16, I fell seriously in love for the first time. And I think it was in order to impress the pretty young Methody girl that I started to write poems and show them to her. They were, of course, not very good. But I'd been bitten by the bug.
Did they impress her, by the way?
I think they did. They didn't keep her from going off with somebody else. But at 16, 17, 18, I had other ambitions. You know, I was keen on games, and I was a bit of a wild lad, and was experimenting with Guinness and cigarettes. So it wasn't really until I went to Trinity, where, believe it or not, in those days, the term was 7 weeks long. Lectures weren't, well, I mean, I managed to avoid going to most of the lectures. There was a marvellous leisurely atmosphere to the place. Dublin was a stimulus. So really from about 1958-59, when I first went to Trinity, I became, for a short period, a full-time poet. You know, I was writing about 7 or 8 poems a day, unbelievable formless, embarrassing, over-emotional splodges. But I was filling notebooks with poems. And then, I suppose, after about a year or two of that, I began to think, you know, that perhaps one should be lending shape to one's, that raw emotion wasn't enough on its own. And by the time I'd taught myself to write 1 or 2 rather dainty little lyrics, Derek Mahan breezed down from Belfast, and we got to know each other. But Derek had been writing seriously from the age of about 16. In fact, I discovered in old school magazines some poems by him as a 16 or 17-year-old, and they're enormously accomplished. So, I mean, he was much further along the road than I was. And I think an important thing that I did then really was embrace friendship with him, although it bruised my ego somewhat to do so. And in his company, we read together, we inhaled contemporary Irish, English and American poetry. We went back to the metaphysicals. It was a self-generated apprenticeship, which was enormously exciting.
And was it just the pair of you at this, or did you have other companions?
It was more or less just Derek Mahan and myself. Brendan Kennelly was there, and he was a year or 2 ahead. And Kennelly was very encouraging. I think Brendan was the first person to publish a poem of mine. That was in the undergraduate magazine Icarus. And he was an extraordinary, effervescent, attractive personality, but somewhat in the middle distance. The 2 northern boys, Mahan and myself, we kept, there was something intense between just the 2 of us.
You picked a very tough gunslinger as a compadre in Mahan, a devil for form and discipline.
Well, well, indeed. I mean, a master a modern master. Fair enough. I got to know Kennelly better subsequently, and then round a few years later, Derek Mahon brought Ivan Boland up to Belfast, and so the parish broadened. The friendships. There were more poetic friendships.
This was what, the early 60s?
Yeah, and my wife-to-be got a job at Queen's, so I returned to Belfast simply to be with her, and she was the first one of us to get a job.
Let me just take you back to before you go back to Belfast. I mean, what sense did you have of the Irish poetry at the time? Say, and specifically say the Dublin literary life. Did you have any connection to that, or were you inside the walls of Trinity for the whole duration of your stay?
I didn't have much connection with it. I mean, it amazes me now that there was so little interchange then between TCD, Trinity, and UCD. But in those were the days of the Dolman Press, when the publication of a book of poems was a major event. And I was aware, in fact I bought and read through many times, the early collections of Kinsella, Montague, Richard Murphy, and then
Richard Weber was then, Richard Macaulay.
Richard,
Yeah,
but those three were the three which the poets of my generation kept an eye on, and you know, and we would all have loved, I think, to have been published by Liam Miller's really wonderful.
But did you feel sealed off from that world? Did you feel that was a world going on without you?
Well, no, I didn't feel sealed off at all. I mean, I used to wander out of Trinity into the city of Dublin. But I mean, it was all demanding enough. There was enough to keep me occupied within the walls of Trinity.
Those 7-week terms, yeah.
Yeah, and I spent far too much time in O'Neill's in where's it, Suffolk Street. Yeah. And I mean, it was wonderful, you know, coming from a Belfast suburb to have a pad in the middle of a major city, and to be within 4 or 5 minutes walk of bookshops, coffee shops, pubs, cinemas, theatres. In no way was I cut off, but I mean, I've never actually been all that literary. I've never really moved in literary circles by choice.
So who was in, say, you leave Trinity, Edna gets the job in Belfast, you move back to Belfast. What happens then? Is there a drop for you, or you've begun publishing in the magazines by then, haven't you?
Oh, yes, I had been, the Dublin magazine, the Irish Times, Terence de Vere White was the first person to publish Symonds, Mahon, Heaney, myself. So the literary side of things, as opposed to the poetic side, was, I suppose, underway by then. And I remember, I think it was a poem called An Advancement of Learning, which was Seamus's first poem, which alerted Derek and me to the fact that there was somebody else knocking around, you know. And then Hobsbawm approached my wife, to be Edna, and said, you know, Michael Longley, I think he should come along to the group. But I didn't want to go because I'm not a joiner, and I have always been and remain slightly dubious of the whole workshop ethos. But anyway, partly because he was a senior colleague of Edna's, I agreed to go. And I'm now glad that I did, because that's where I met Seamus, and that friendship got off the ground more or less at once. And it was important too to meet Mary Devlin, who was Seamus's wife-to-be, and I hadn't learned to drive. So there was a wonderful period when we went off as a foursome in Heaney's navy blue. No, it was a Volkswagen.
Oh, it was I had the Humber Sniper. It must have been.
Yeah, it was a battered, characterful Volkswagen, which took us all around, mainly County Down, but also I visited the Heaney house in Balachi and the Devlin house in our bow on the shores of Loch Bay.
But while you're touring the geography of the place and sort of absorbing that, and so much of it comes up in your later work, what about is it the intellectual or the poetic hinterland? I mean, Hewitt, for instance, has been a touchstone for you for much of your life. Had you run into Hewitt at this stage? Was he still away?
No, Hewitt was still away.
Yeah.
I mean, he was something of an absence, mind you.
Yeah. Were you reading the work? Was it shaping what you were writing?
No, I wasn't studying Hewitt.
Did you feel that there was a Belfast, a literary Belfast you could write yourself into or become a part of?
No, I now know retrospectively that there was.
Yeah.
But I didn't really, I mean, the poets who mattered to me from Northern Ireland at that time were W.R. Rogers and Louis MacNeice, and then latterly Patrick Kavanagh. Yeah. I wasn't aware then of that wonderful kind of slightly pink socialist fifth column that existed in the North with writers like John Boyd, Sam Hannibal, John Hewitt, in a sense, incipient critics of the unionist status quo.
Were you very aware of it?
I mean, I value them very much now, but rather retrospectively.
Yeah. Were you aware, though, that there was a tradition you could inscribe yourself into? What I'm trying to get at is, were you refusing it, or were you just couldn't care less?
I don't actually think all that much in terms of traditions as narrowly localized as that. I mean, I think of myself as an Irish writer with a northern accent, perhaps. And I'm, grateful and excited by the fact that there are other people who've been there before me. But I mean, I don't think in terms of some kind of apostolic succession.
No, I wasn't thinking. I was thinking more in terms of, say, a context in which you could look at your work as you begin to go deeper into the world of poetry. You become more aware of yourself from the outside. But I suppose you were probably more aware of the Americans of the stage, or of, say, the movement poets in the UK, than you were of Irish poets at that time.
Well, I mean, I think my group, my contemporaries, I mean, people like Heaney, Mahan, Simmons, for instance, we were reading everything. We weren't confining ourselves to, I mean, we were aware of Hewitt, for instance. We were aware of Kavanagh and MacNeice. In fact, we would have regarded them as avuncular figures, as poetic uncles, if you like.
Were you reading, say, the Beats? Were you reading Robert Duncan? Were you reading Snyder?
No, the books that really mattered to us, that we carried around in our pockets, would have been the A. Alvarez, the New Poetry, and Donald Hall's contemporary American poetry. Did
you feel that there was a new wave breaking through the island as there was throughout the rest of Western Europe? Did you feel you were part of that?
No, I think we were more modest than that. I remember Philip Hobsbawm wrote an article in the Spectator in the mid-60s to say that Belfast would become famous for its poetry and for its writing and so forth. And although we were grateful for him, we thought he was being somewhat hyperbolic,
Your first collection comes out, and sort of, this is where the art and history begin to chime. I suppose your first book comes out in 1969, just as the North begins that long, terrible disintegration.
Yes, it was nearly as bad as having a book like Flann O'Brien published in 1939.
And on the eve of the Second World War.
Yeah, and of course, some people actually criticised my first book for having nothing in it that was relevant to the Troubles.
How many years were gathered into that first book?
About a decade.
Yeah.
A decade. I had trouble getting a publisher for it, and each time it came back, I removed one or two weaker poems and put in one or two stronger poems. So I'm now grateful. And when young poets ask me for advice, I say wait until you're 30 before you publish.
But this book comes out, and at that stage, your life had been intelligible to you, and now suddenly, everywhere around you look as death and destruction. I mean, it must have made you, at some stage, stop and think, is it enough to be a poet in times such as these?
No, I've never felt that being a poet should be measured in that way. nevertheless, we were sensitive as a group of young writers to the simple question, where are the war poets, which was journalistic and shallow, but on the other hand, a perfectly reasonable question to ask. And but it took some time before any one of us wrote a poem that could be called a Troubles poem or a political poem. I mean, I think it was John Hume referred to the politics of the last atrocity. I think the poem of the last atrocity is unattractive in exactly the same way.
In 1973, when An Exploded View came out, you were starting to take on these public events, these public occurrences. But it's where the memory of your father as a victim of the First World War appears. It's a motif that's to occur over and over in your poems. What brought your father forward as an image to allow you to deal with the Troubles?
Well, I wanted some personal way into this communal catastrophe. And I asked myself the simple question, what would my father, as an old soldier, make of the mayhem? And that's how I wrote the first poem of mine, Wounds, which has any reputation as a comment on the Troubles.
Did you have a sense you were using your father's situation as an image, or was he speaking through you? Did you have a sense that he was actually speaking through you?
No, I used him as an image and shaped his experience to suit the poem, to be quite frank. I think it was Mary Heaney who told me the story of the Ulster Division going over the top. I make that my father's, I mean, this is a poetic confession. I make that my father's memory in the poem for the sake of the inner logic and the illumination that the story gives. So my father, in a way, is a supplier of images. Yes.
Yeah. Did you want to make him speak for other victims as well?
No, I don't think one can speak for victims.
Because I have a sense in Wounds that it's part personal exploration, the archaeology of family, but that it's a very emblematic poem.
All I'm trying to do is to bear witness, is to put down the facts in a way that makes some sense out of the nonsense of fratricidal sectarian violence.
Did it prompt the question for you, what are poems for?
Well, I still don't know what poems are for. All I know is that poems happen, and that they happen in extreme circumstances, that it's part of human nature to want to express itself in poetry, that in extremis human beings turn to poetry, whether it's the death camps of Auschwitz, whether it's the trenches of northern France in the 1914-18 war. It seems important to write poems. Why this should be so, I'm not certain. And what use it is, I don't know. I just think it's an aspect of the human soul to arrange in certain circumstances and at certain times to arrange words in patterns that have a truth beyond the message.
Do you feel that poems are part of constructing civility?
They're part of testing civility, perhaps. Civility is an interesting word, civis, citizen, community. The interesting thing about poetry is that it uses this daily commodity, this language which everybody uses. And I think what good poetry does is it uses language in a precise and suggestive way, and it finds within the language inevitable shapes and pulses that illuminate and inspire beyond the paraphrasable message. There's something. I think poetry has its roots, has tap roots in song, and in dance, and in spell, and in curse, and in prayer. It's something profound and ultimately inexplicable. All you can say in the last analysis, to use a flat word phrase, all you can say in the last analysis, look, this is a poem, read it.
Do you think poetry has a duty to history?
No, I don't think a poet has any duty whatsoever, except to his or her imagination and to the purity, the potential of the language.
You've had a long life in poetry, a long studied, disciplined, professional life in poetry, and yet you've noticed, as I do, that a lot of people have a fear of poetry. It's often expressed as contempt or as dismissal. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think one of the things it comes from is bad teaching. We live in the world of the soundbite. That's commonplace, really, to say that poetry requires time and attention and patience. I also think the modernist movement in all of the arts. I mean, I'm not saying that the modernist art and modernist poetry is bad, but I think it did frighten off the general audience.
Is that because the schools seized on contemporary poetry? I mean, the universities, for instance. Do you think that's a factor there?
No, I think that's part of the correction now.
Yeah.
And you know, I think the fact that poets like Durkan and Paul Durkan and Seamus Heaney and Brendan Kennelly get into the bestseller lists indicates that in this country, people in this country at least, people are less intimidated by poetry than perhaps they used to be, or perhaps they are elsewhere.
Journalists in particular are very inclined to suggest that poetry is a minority preoccupation, as if that's automatically a bad thing. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't. I mean, that's not my fault. That it's. I mean, there's nothing I can do about that. Yeah. And thinking about it is a waste of time. I really dislike artists who court popularity. I mean, for instance, like the Three Tenors. You know. I mean, I find that curdling and in its unattractiveness. I think all an artist can do is be true to his or her art and hope that more and more people will come to it. But I mean, the really heroic people, the really heroic artists are artists like James Joyce, who lock themselves away and spend, say, 10, 17 years writing a book which they know is going to take a long time to get any attention whatsoever.
But aren't there other ways to be an artist besides being heroic?
I think one's got to be true to oneself. I think bravery, courage, is a crucial ingredient. But of course, so is enjoyment and joy. There's a poetry of equable joy. There's poetry of challenge. There's comic poetry. I mean, I like McNeece's notion of the description of the poet as somebody who lives life fully and is interested in world events and in sport and all of those things. But I think to endure all the disappointments of being an artist, as well as the joys and the pleasures, means that courage is important.
In recent years, in the last 10 years or so, you've begun to draw very heavily on classical motifs in your poems. You've turned very firmly in two directions simultaneously, maybe influenced by Japan, I don't know. Partly to the nature poems which you write out of the time you spend in Mayo, it seems to me. Very much to say, to the Iliad, to the Aeneid. What's that instinct that sends you back to those places?
Well, it was partly I neglected the classics when I was a student, a classics student. But it was also returning in my 40s to the Odyssey and the Iliad. um, they those two great books provided me with a kind of emotional vocabulary to talk about some things that I'd found very painful, like my parents' deaths, for instance, like the Troubles.
Father and son a lot.
Yeah.
Aeneas carrying his father out of the burning city.
And Odysseus and Laertes. So it was an opening up, and it was an extraordinary moment. To call it a moment, it was a period, an extraordinary period of recognition and very, very deep chimes that I got from Homer.
A sense of very powerful energies released in the last couple of books. Is it because of that, do you think?
Yes, I think that cross-pollination helped. And then the west of Ireland, County Mayo, has been central to my life for 30 years. That's my home from home, as I call it. And been going there for 30 years has been important because I realize I'm only scratching the surface. And I'll need another 30 years before I really know how to read the landscape and the weather and know what's happening.
Why do you keep at it? Why do you keep writing poems?
Because I feel, Theo, that I'm only beginning. And I haven't always written poems.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a period in my 40s, there was almost a decade, when I wrote very little. And years when I wrote nothing. So if they don't come, I don't write. So when they do come, I'm very grateful. And after my long silence, when I was at just about 50, I started to write again, and I felt like I felt in my 20s. So I mean, it's for the excitement. I mean, it's far more exciting than in my life anyway. Yeah. It's far more exciting than eating or drinking or sex, and I think I'm just hooked.
Do we need poetry? And I don't mean just you know, but I mean generally as a people. Do we need poetry? Has it been supplanted by something else?
No, I think we do need it. It's of great value. It's of no use. It is a human requirement. It's a form of art that people often turn to at moments that are heightened. You know, at moments of falling in love, when you fall in love, or when you're bereaved, or even when it's just a beautiful day.
I'm struck by how often there's sort of three phrases. John Montague's "Old molds are broken in the north." Your own, "I go down on my knees and do what must be done," and kiss Achilles'
hand,
and
the killer of my son.
That and Seamus's "Where hope and history rhyme." I mean,
Yeah.
how often in the sort of the convergence of the elements of peace in the north, those lines have been quoted. It's almost as if poetry is a kind of a recourse which stays there and waits for its moment.
Yes, I suppose you could put it that way. I certainly feel that one of the things I want to do, it was Frost who said this, one of the things he wanted to do was to just lodge a few poems where they couldn't be got rid of. But, I mean, I write primarily for myself, and then after that I write for the entire world.
Michael Longley, thank you very much.